Egypt was full of Jews. Despite their small numbers, they had a significant impact on Egyptian history. Some of them caused civil wars, some spied for the Zionist entity, and some were involved in bombings and fires on Egyptian soil. They even wanted Israel to be established on Egyptian land instead of Palestine. Their history is long, and they might be among the oldest Jewish communities in the Arab world. If you want to learn about their presence, their status in Egypt, their prosperity, their economic roles, and their migration to Israel, then you must continue watching today's video. In Pharaonic Egypt, Jews didn't have a true presence, nor were they a real civilization like other peoples. They were always a nomadic sect, moving between Iraq, Canaan, and Sinai. During a time of famine, the Israelites arrived in Egypt and settled there. But after centuries, they left with Prophet Moses in the famous Exodus story. The Jews later tried to falsify their history in Egypt, attempting to prove they contributed to ancient Egyptian civilization. But the truth is the opposite. Their presence was extremely limited. After their first departure from Egypt, they returned again when Palestine fell under Assyrian and later Babylonian control. That's when Jews dispersed across North Africa, including Egypt. King Opres welcomed them after the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple, settling them in places like Taphens, now Tel Defena. Some of them became mercenaries in the Egyptian army and were stationed on Elephantine Island in Aswan. The Jews on Elephantine Island lived both civilian and military lives, with homes and temples and no conflict with the Egyptians at the time. They lived well and spread across the island and beyond. But as usual with the Jews, when the Persians invaded Egypt, they chose to side with the stronger enemy. They pledged loyalty to the Persian king and were rewarded by being allowed to keep their temple intact, even while the Persians destroyed Egyptian temples. This caused a rift between Jews and Egyptians. After the Persians were expelled and Egyptians regained control, they retaliated against the Jews, destroying their temples, especially since the Jews had helped the Persians suppress Egyptian revolts. When Alexander the Great entered Egypt, a new chapter began for the Jews. The Ptolemies loved employing foreign peoples in their new territories, so the Jews began returning to Egypt again. Alexandria became one of the most important Jewish centers in the world after Jerusalem and Babylon. They didn't just live there, they turned it into a major religious and cultural hub. The Ptolemies also used Jews in their army. They served as mercenaries and garrison forces along borders. In return, they were granted freedom to establish independent communities with their own laws and administrative systems. But if things were so peaceful between the Jews and Ptolemies, why were relations with the Greeks always tense? Because Jewish behavior often stirred conflict. On multiple occasions, Jews in Egypt sided with the Romans against the Ptolemies. In 55 BC, they helped Gabinius enter Egypt and restore Ptolemy to the throne. During Julius Caesar's siege of Alexandria, the Jews facilitated his forces' entry. They also allied with Octavian against Cleopatra to end Ptolemaic rule. The Jews during Roman rule. When the Romans took over Egypt, the Jewish community was already very large, especially in Alexandria. They had been well established since Ptolemaic times, recognized officially, worshiping freely, and running their own temples. Initially, the Romans allowed the Jews to live according to their customs in exchange for paying taxes. But things quickly deteriorated. The Greeks grew resentful, accusing Jews of having privileges they didn't deserve as non-citizens. Massacres and persecution followed, with many Jews killed. The pressure mounted, especially as the Romans tried to impose a unified form of worship on the Jews. In the 1st century CE, large-scale Jewish revolts broke out, particularly in Palestine. Egyptian Jews joined some of these movements, which raised suspicion about their loyalty. The result? Even harsher restrictions on the Jewish community, especially in Alexandria. Over the next centuries, their situation worsened. They were banned from certain professions, subjected to legal discrimination, and their temples were placed under surveillance. Eventually, they were forced to leave their Jewish neighborhoods and were expelled from Alexandria. After being severely oppressed under the Ptolemies and Romans due to their religion, came the Islamic conquest of Egypt. In 641 CE, Amr ibn al-As entered Egypt. And let me tell you, for the Jews, the Islamic conquest was like escaping from hell. Islam recognized Jews as people of the book. They were granted religious freedom in exchange for paying the jizya tax, and they were allowed to live freely and safely as long as they obeyed the law and refrained from conspiracies. They reopened their temples, began rebuilding their community under the Islamic State, started engaging in commerce, and successfully revived their Jewish community. Jewish immigration to Egypt increased due to improved conditions under Islamic rule. They even had their own legal and religious systems based on the Torah. While they had previously been concentrated in Alexandria under Ptolemaic and Roman rule, they now moved to the new capital, Fustat. There, they had a dedicated Jewish quarter with synagogues and religious institutions. If you read the Cairo-Geniza documents, you'll see just how active and wealthy the Jewish community was at the time. During the Umayyad and Abbasid periods, Jews held prominent positions, and intellectuals among them were close to Muslim caliphs. However, by the end of the Abbasid era, restrictions began to appear. Jews were forced to wear distinct clothing and live in designated areas. During the Fatimid era, treatment of Jews varied depending on the caliph's personality. Caliph al-Mu'izz was open-minded and granted Jews significant freedom, even employing some in the Fatimid court. But Caliph al-Hakim imposed severe restrictions, destroyed some synagogues, and banned them from riding horses. After his death, Jews resumed normal life again. What was unique about the Jews in Islamic Egypt was that they managed to integrate into society, speaking Arabic and interacting with Muslims daily, while still preserving their religious customs and traditions. This was evident in figures like Maimonides, the famous physician born in Andalusia who lived in Cairo and became the personal doctor of Saladin. Despite occasional tensions, Jews in Egypt generally lived in safety, and the Islamic State never forced them to change their religion or incited violence against them, unlike Europe. They enjoyed relative stability, built an organized community, and contributed to Egypt's economy and culture. In the late 19th century, especially after the British occupation of Egypt in 1882, the Jewish community began to play a visibly active role in Egyptian life. They were no longer just a religious minority. They were influential in business, commerce, and culture. One of the most famous Jewish neighborhoods was Harat al-Yahud, the Jewish quarter in the heart of Cairo's Al-Gamaleya district. It was a social and cultural hub, with synagogues, shops, and Jewish doctors serving the entire community. During British rule, Jews became prominent in trade. Families like the Katawis and Shorels owned major retail chains, and many Jews were involved in the Omar Effendi department store. But with the rise of the Zionist movement in the early 20th century, especially after the Balfour Declaration in 1917, Egyptians began to view Jews differently. They were automatically associated with Zionism, even though most Egyptian Jews rejected it. Many even joined national movements, and some participated in the 1919 revolution against the British. However, over time, the British authorities began favoring the Jews, treating them as important societal members. With British privileges, Jews increasingly welcomed the British presence, fueling Egyptian resentment as they saw Jews siding with the colonial power. But the real turning point came after the 1948 Palestine War and the establishment of Israel on occupied Palestinian land. Tensions rose in Egyptian streets, and violent acts targeted Jewish businesses, especially after the Lavon Affair, in which Jewish youth in Egypt were caught bombing Egyptian sites with Mossad's help. President Gamal Abdel Nasser responded decisively, expelling foreigners from Egypt, starting with the Jews. Between 1948 and 1956, there were mass waves of Jewish emigration, not only to Israel, but also to France, Italy, and even Latin America. Many left without their property. Their Egyptian citizenship was revoked, synagogues closed, and businesses shut down. Harat al-Yahud, once bustling, began to empty. By the 1960s, only a few elderly Jews remained. Yet many Jews who left Egypt later stated that they had lived peacefully for decades, never feeling persecuted. Some families even tried to return after the 1973 October War, but since they now held Israeli citizenship, their applications were rejected. Although the Jewish community in Egypt has almost disappeared today, their heritage and synagogues still exist in Cairo and Alexandria. In 2003, the last official census recorded fewer than 5,680 Jews in Egypt, a huge drop from 90,000 in 1948. By 2009, the number had dropped to fewer than 20. But according to Magda Haroun, head of Egypt's Jewish community, many Jews converted to other religions during Nasser's era out of fear of persecution, and those people are still living in Egypt today. And surely you all know of Jews who refused to abandon their Egyptian identity, like the actor Omar Sharif, who converted to Islam and remained in Egypt, and singer Layla Murad, who also converted and refused to migrate to occupied Palestine, choosing instead to stay in Egypt. When Egyptian Jews reached Israel, they quickly integrated with Israeli elites in Tel Aviv, thanks to their knowledge of French or Italian, and because they were fewer in number compared to Moroccan Jews, for example. Some achieved diplomatic and academic positions, but they never formed a significant political or social bloc.